According to public records from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Melissa Elizabeth Lucio has been incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, since 2008. Court documents indicate she was convicted of capital murder following the death of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez, and was sentenced to death on July 10, 2008, in Cameron County, Texas. As of February 2026, Lucio has spent more than 17 years on death row, making her one of the longest-serving women under a capital sentence in the state's history. State records show that Lucio is currently housed in a single-cell unit designated for female inmates under sentence of death. The Mountain View Unit, located in Gatesville, Texas, is the facility where the Texas Department of Criminal Justice houses all women sentenced to death in the state. According to institutional records, Lucio was born on June 18, 1969, in Lubbock, Texas, making her 56 years old at the time of this documentary's production. Court documents indicate that Lucio is the first woman of Latino descent to be sentenced to death in the state of Texas. Her case has remained under active judicial review for more than a decade, with proceedings continuing through multiple levels of both state and federal courts. Public legal filings confirm that, as of February 2026, her conviction and death sentence remain under formal consideration by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the state's highest criminal court, following a series of significant judicial findings in 2024. According to filings recorded in the 138th Judicial District Court of Cameron County, the presiding judge, who oversaw Lucio's original trial, formally recommended in October 2024 that her conviction and death sentence be vacated. That recommendation, which cited findings of actual innocence and documented constitutional violations during the original prosecution, was transmitted to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, where it remains pending a final decision. Legal proceedings therefore continue to unfold in this case as of the date of this production. The circumstances surrounding Lucio's case involve questions about the reliability of forensic evidence presented at trial, the conduct of the original interrogation, the completeness of evidence disclosed to the defense, and the interpretation of medical findings related to her daughter's injuries. These questions have been the subject of extensive judicial examination, expert analysis, and formal legal challenge over the course of more than 15 years of post-conviction proceedings. This documentary presents an account of the case as documented in public court records, legal filings, institutional records, and official judicial findings. All information is attributed to verifiable sources. The purpose of this presentation is educational, providing an analysis of the legal proceedings, forensic disputes, and appellate history that define this case within the broader context of the American capital punishment system. The events that led to Melissa Lucio's arrest and capital conviction occurred in Harlingen, Texas, a city in Cameron County located in the southernmost region of the state, an area commonly referred to as the Rio Grande Valley. According to the United States Census Bureau, Harlingen had a population of approximately 65,000 residents at the time of the events in question. The city is situated along the northern bank of the Rio Grande, near the international border with Mexico, and forms part of one of the most economically disadvantaged regions in the United States. Harlingen serves as a commercial and administrative center for the lower valley, and its surrounding communities reflect the demographic and economic conditions that characterize the broader region. Public records indicate that the Rio Grande Valley, as a geographic and economic region, has historically recorded some of the highest poverty rates in Texas. According to data from the United States Census Bureau corresponding to the early 2000s, Cameron County regularly ranked among the lowest income counties in the state. A significant portion of the population lived at or below the federal poverty line, and social services infrastructure, including child welfare and family support systems, operated under substantial resource constraints during this period. Access to healthcare, legal representation, and mental health services was limited for many residents, particularly those in lower-income households. Melissa Lucio was residing in Harlingen with her partner, Robert Alvarez, and their children at the time of the events in February 2007. Court documents indicate that the family had been living in conditions of significant poverty and had experienced periods of housing instability. According to institutional records and testimony presented during the trial, Child Protective Services, then administered by the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, had an extensive and documented history of involvement with the Lucio household dating back to at least December 1995. This history of agency contact formed part of the institutional record that both the prosecution and the defense drew upon during trial proceedings. The social context in which this case developed was shaped by a combination of factors documented in the public record, including generational poverty, domestic instability, and the challenges faced by large, low-income families in the Rio Grande Valley during the early 2000s. Court records reflect that Lucio had given birth to 12 children by the time she was in her mid-30s, several of whom were minors living in the household at the time of the events described in this case. The management of a large household in conditions of economic hardship, combined with the documented history of domestic instability, formed the background against which the events of February 2007 unfolded. According to testimony presented in court, the family was in the process of relocating to a new residence in Harlingen during the days leading up to February 17, 2007, the date on which Lucio's 2-year-old daughter, Mariah Alvarez, was found unresponsive and subsequently pronounced deceased at a local hospital. Court records indicate that Mariah had been born on September 6, 2004, and that she had been placed in foster care by Child Protective Services shortly after her birth, before being returned to the Lucio household on November 21, 2006. The period between Mariah's return to the family home and the events of February 2007 was approximately 3 months. The broader institutional environment of Cameron County in the early 2000s is relevant to understanding how this case was investigated and prosecuted. According to public administrative records, the county's Child Protective Services Office maintained sustained contact with numerous families in the region. The prosecutorial apparatus of Cameron County played a central role in the legal proceedings that followed Mariah's death. Court records indicate that the former Cameron County District Attorney, who prosecuted Lucio, was subsequently convicted in federal court in 2014 on charges of extortion in a case unrelated to Lucio's. The year 2007 in Texas occurred within a broader national context of ongoing debate about child welfare practices, forensic pathology standards, and the application of capital punishment in cases involving contested evidence. According to legal scholarship and judicial records from this period, questions about the reliability of forensic testimony in child death cases were emerging in courts across the United States, including in Texas. Public legal filings establish that the case against Lucio centered on the prosecution's contention that Mariah's injuries were inconsistent with an accidental cause of death. That forensic interpretation would become the subject of sustained legal challenge in the years following the conviction. Court documents establish that the sequence of events directly preceding Mariah Alvarez's death began on February 15, 2007. According to legal filings and witness statements entered into the record, the Lucio family was in the process of moving from one residence to another within Harlingen, Texas, on that date. Public records indicate that Mariah, who was 2 years old at the time, fell down a flight of exterior stairs at the family's new residence during the course of the move. According to statements submitted to the court by Lucio and supported by accounts from several of her older children who were present at the time, Mariah fell on the outdoor staircase leading to the apartment the family was relocating to. Post-conviction legal filings note that Mariah had a documented physical condition that affected her gait, specifically a misalignment of her feet that rendered her walking unstable and made her susceptible to falls. Following the incident on February 15th, the child did not appear to require emergency medical attention, and the family continued the process of settling into their new residence over the next 2 days. Court records indicate that on the morning of February 17, 2007, Melissa Lucio placed Mariah down for a nap in the family's bedroom. According to the accounts submitted in legal filings, the child did not wake up. At approximately 12:37 in the afternoon of that date, paramedics were dispatched to the Lucio residence in response to an emergency call reporting that a 2-year-old child was unresponsive and not breathing. According to public records from the Cameron County Medical and Emergency Services System, responding personnel were unable to resuscitate the child at the scene. Mariah Alvarez was transported to a local hospital where she was pronounced deceased. According to court testimony, the examining physicians noted the presence of physical injuries on the child's body, including bruising in various stages of healing distributed across multiple areas, an injury to her head, and internal injuries documented in the subsequent autopsy. The presence and nature of these injuries became the central forensic dispute of the case. According to court records, law enforcement personnel from the Harlingen Police Department and the Texas Rangers responded to the hospital following Mariah's death. Texas Ranger Victor Escalon, who subsequently played a significant role in the investigation, was among the officers present that evening. Public legal filings indicate that Melissa Lucio was taken into custody for questioning on the night of February 17, 2007, within hours of her daughter's death. She was transported to the Harlingen Police Department, where she was questioned for a period that varied in documented accounts between 5 and 7 hours. According to legal records and interrogation documentation subsequently reviewed in post-conviction proceedings, Lucio was questioned without legal counsel present. Court filings established that she was pregnant with twins at the time of the interrogation. During the course of the questioning, Lucio repeatedly stated that she had not harmed her daughter. Post-conviction legal filings document that she asserted her innocence on more than 100 occasions during the interrogation, both verbally and through non-verbal responses. At certain points during the prolonged questioning, Lucio made statements that the prosecution later characterized as admissions of responsibility for causing injury to her daughter. The content and circumstances of this interrogation became a central issue in subsequent legal proceedings. Court documents from post-conviction reviews indicate that Lucio's statements were recorded, and that the full interrogation footage was later reviewed and analyzed by forensic and psychological experts. The question of whether the statements obtained during that session constituted a voluntary and reliable admission, or whether they were the product of coercive interrogation circumstances, was formally litigated in multiple courts over the following decade and a half. According to records from the Cameron County District Attorney's Office, Mariah's body underwent an official autopsy conducted by the county's medical examiner. Court documents indicate that the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy concluded that the child's injuries were inconsistent with an accidental fall and were instead the result of physical abuse. That conclusion formed the forensic foundation of the subsequent criminal prosecution. The medical examiner's findings and the methodology underlying them were later subject to extensive expert review and judicial examination in post-conviction proceedings, with multiple forensic specialists reaching conclusions different from those presented at trial. The nature and extent of the injuries documented on Mariah's body became the central evidentiary dispute of the subsequent criminal proceedings. Court records reflect that injuries included bruising in multiple locations in varying stages of healing, a head injury, and internal trauma documented during the autopsy. The prosecution would argue at trial that this pattern demonstrated repeated and intentional physical harm. Defense counsel and post-conviction experts would argue that the injuries were consistent with the fall of February 15th, compounded by the child's documented physical condition and the vulnerability of a 2-year-old's developing physiology. The 2-day interval between Mariah's fall and her death became a significant point of forensic and legal analysis in subsequent proceedings. According to post-conviction expert testimony referenced in court filings, delayed onset of life-threatening neurological deterioration following head trauma is a documented medical phenomenon, and the progression of certain injuries from a fall can produce internal effects that are not immediately apparent at the time of the initial incident. This medical context was central to the defense argument that the forensic evidence was consistent with an accidental cause of death. Following the completion of the initial investigation, Melissa Lucio was formally charged with capital murder. According to court records from Cameron County, she was detained pending the resolution of criminal proceedings. The events of February 15 through 17, 2007, as documented in public legal records, mark the beginning of a legal process that would extend across more than 17 years of judicial proceedings, forensic re-examination, and appellate review. Court documents and psychological evaluations presented in the context of both the original trial and subsequent post-conviction proceedings provide a detailed account of Melissa Lucio's personal history, developmental background, and clinical profile. According to these records, Lucio was born on June 18, 1969 in Lubbock, Texas. Court filings indicate that her father died when she was an infant, and that her mother subsequently relocated the family to the Rio Grande Valley, where Lucio spent the majority of her childhood and adolescent years. Psychological evaluations presented in court during post-conviction proceedings documented that Lucio reported experiencing sexual abuse beginning when she was approximately 7 years old, inflicted by her mother's domestic partner over a period of approximately 2 years. These disclosures are consistent with statements made by Lucio to mental health professionals and were referenced in expert testimony submitted to the court in the course of legal proceedings following her conviction. According to clinical assessments documented in the legal record, Lucio did not receive therapeutic intervention or formal support services during her childhood in response to these reported experiences. Court records indicate that Lucio married for the first time at the age of 16. Legal filings note that this marriage was permitted under Texas law at the time with parental consent, even though she had not reached the standard age of majority. According to court documents, her first husband, Guadalupe Lucio, was involved in substance use and was described in testimony as engaging in physically abusive behavior toward Lucio. She had 5 children with Guadalupe Lucio before the marriage ended. Following the dissolution of that relationship, Lucio entered into a subsequent relationship with Robert Alvarez, with whom she had additional children, including Mariah. Psychological evaluations presented in court documented that Lucio's adult relationships were characterized by a pattern of involvement with partners who engaged in controlling, abusive, or substance-dependent behavior. Expert testimony indicated that this pattern was consistent with documented clinical research on the relational behavior of individuals who have experienced prolonged interpersonal trauma beginning in childhood. According to forensic psychological evaluations submitted in post-conviction proceedings, Lucio was assessed as having significant impairments in her capacity to protect herself and her children from abusive relationship dynamics. Clinical assessments documented in court records indicate that by her mid-30s, Lucio had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and battered woman syndrome. According to expert testimony presented in post-conviction proceedings, these diagnoses were supported by her documented history of repeated trauma exposure, her described behavioral responses to stress and authority, and the results of standardized psychological assessments administered by clinicians who evaluated her in a professional capacity in connection with her legal case. Psychological evaluations presented in court during the post-conviction review process addressed specifically the question of Lucio's behavior during the interrogation that took place on the night of February 17, 2007. Expert testimony indicated that Lucio's demeanor during that session, including her passive affect, limited eye contact, and conciliatory verbal responses, was clinically consistent with the documented behavioral responses of individuals with a history of prolonged trauma and abuse. According to expert witnesses, individuals with Lucio's documented clinical profile are statistically more susceptible to producing statements during coercive or high-pressure interrogations that do not accurately reflect their actual knowledge or conduct. Court records indicate that during the original trial in 2008, the presiding judge ruled that expert witnesses who had been prepared to testify on this subject, specifically a psychologist and a mitigation specialist who had evaluated Lucio and reviewed her history, were barred from offering testimony on questions of innocence during the guilt phase of the proceedings. According to appellate filings, this ruling prevented the jury from hearing clinical context that would have been relevant to evaluating the statements Lucio made during her interrogation. Child Protective Services records cited in court documents document that the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services had extensive involvement with the Lucio household dating back to December 1995. According to institutional records referenced in testimony, CPS workers had contact with the family on numerous occasions over the course of more than a decade. Court filings note that Mariah was removed from the Lucio home shortly after her birth in September 2004, and placed in foster care along with other children from the household due to findings of physical neglect and negligent supervision. She was returned to the family home on November 21, 2006, approximately 3 months before her death. Expert testimony presented in post-conviction proceedings documented that the CPS records compiled over the period of the agency's involvement with the Lucio family contained no documented findings of physical abuse directed by Lucio toward her children. According to court filings, a federal appellate judge reviewing the case on post-conviction habeas corpus proceedings noted that despite years of sustained institutional oversight, the Child Welfare Agency had never recorded or expressed concern that Lucio physically abused any of the children in her care. According to institutional records and court documents, Lucio's extensive history as a survivor of abuse, her documented mental health diagnoses, and the clinical characteristics identified in psychological evaluations were presented by defense experts as directly relevant to understanding her behavior, both in the period following her daughter's death and during the interrogation session that produced statements relied upon by the prosecution at trial. Court records further document that the pattern of Lucio's relationships, her documented exposure to domestic violence, and her responses to institutional authority were consistent with clinical literature on individuals who have experienced chronic interpersonal trauma. Expert witnesses who evaluated her noted that her ability to advocate for herself in high-pressure institutional settings, including police interrogations, was substantially impaired by her history and diagnoses. According to post-conviction legal filings, these clinical characteristics were precisely the factors that the excluded expert testimony at trial had been prepared to explain to the jury. The Innocence Project, which formally took on Lucio's case in January 2022, documented in public filings that the clinical profile established through years of expert evaluation supported her account of the events surrounding Mariah's death and her behavior during the interrogation. According to filings submitted on her behalf, the convergence of her trauma history, her diagnoses, and the coercive conditions of the interrogation created circumstances in which the statements she made could not be reliably interpreted as accurate admissions of guilt. According to public records and court documents, the formal investigation into the death of Mariah Alvarez was initiated on February 17, 2007, following the child's arrival at the hospital and her subsequent pronouncement of death. The Harlingen Police Department and the Texas Rangers were the primary law enforcement agencies involved in the initial investigation. Texas Ranger Victor Escalon assumed a central role in the investigation from its earliest stages, according to trial records and court filings. The investigation began with the questioning of Melissa Lucio on the night of February 17, 2007, at the Harlingen Police Department. Court records document that the interrogation session lasted for a period that multiple legal filings describe as between 5 and 7 hours. According to court documents, Lucio was not provided with food or water during the interrogation. Legal filings further note that she was not provided access to legal counsel during the session and that she was pregnant with twins at the time of the questioning. The full interrogation was recorded, and this recording was subsequently reviewed in the context of post-conviction proceedings. According to legal records, an autopsy of Mariah Alvarez was conducted by the Cameron County Medical Examiner, Dr. Beese Norma Farley. Court documents indicate that investigating officers were present at the autopsy facility when the examination was conducted. Post-conviction legal filings raised questions about the circumstances of the autopsy, noting that the medical examiner had received information about Lucio's interrogation statements prior to or during the course of the examination. Court documents from post-conviction proceedings recorded that Dr. Farley testified at trial that she had concluded the child was a victim of physical abuse before completing the internal examination of the body. The forensic evidence collected during the investigation included the findings from the autopsy, photographic documentation of the child's injuries, medical records from the hospital, and evidence gathered from a search of the Lucio family's residence. According to court records, law enforcement discovered drug paraphernalia associated with crack cocaine in the apartment during the search. Court filings also documented that toxicological analysis conducted as part of the autopsy found the presence of cocaine in the child's system at the time of death. According to testimony presented at trial and documented in court records, the investigation also involved a review of the family's history with Child Protective Services. CPS caseworker Maria Estrada testified at trial under a grant of transactional immunity, according to court records, that CPS had been in regular contact with the Lucio household over a period of more than a decade. Her testimony addressed the agency's interactions with the family, the placement of Mariah and other children in foster care, and the conditions under which they had been returned to the household. The arrest of Melissa Lucio occurred in the context of the investigation that followed Mariah's death on February 17, 2007. According to public records, criminal charges were filed against Lucio in Cameron County. The charge of capital murder was based on the prosecution's position that the evidence collected during the investigation, including the autopsy findings and the statements made during the interrogation, established that Lucio had caused her daughter's death through intentional physical acts. Robert Alvarez, Mariah's father, and Lucio's domestic partner, was also arrested in connection with the case. According to court records, he was ultimately charged with child endangerment rather than capital murder. Court documents indicate that he was subsequently sentenced to 4 years of imprisonment, a significantly different outcome from the capital charge and death sentence that Lucio ultimately received. The disparity in charges and outcomes between Lucio and Alvarez became a point of legal discussion in subsequent proceedings. Following the formal arrest and charging of Melissa Lucio, the case was prepared for prosecution in the 138th Judicial District Court of Cameron County, Texas. According to court records, the presiding judge in the proceedings was Judge Arturo Nelson. The investigation phase concluded with the submission of evidence to the district attorney's office and the initiation of formal criminal proceedings against Lucio. The investigation, as documented in court records, did not produce any eyewitness testimony from outside the family who directly observed Lucio cause injury to Mariah. According to post-conviction legal filings, no documented record within the Child Protective Services case history recorded an observation of Lucio physically harming any of her children during the more than decade of institutional oversight. The prosecution's case rested on the forensic interpretation of the child's injuries, the interrogation statements, and the circumstantial evidence regarding the family's history and living conditions. The criminal trial of Melissa Lucio was conducted in the summer of 2008 at the Cameron County Courthouse in Brownsville, Texas, before Judge Arturo Nelson. According to court records, the proceedings were presided over in the 138th Judicial District Court of Cameron County. The trial involved the formal presentation of evidence by the prosecution and the defense, before a jury convened for the purpose of determining Lucio's guilt or innocence on the charge of capital murder. According to court documents, the prosecution's case was built around 3 primary pillars: the forensic testimony of the medical examiner regarding the nature and cause of Mariah's injuries, the statements made by Lucio during her interrogation on the night of her daughter's death, and evidence regarding the history of the family's interactions with child welfare services. The former Cameron County District Attorney's Office characterized the interrogation statements as a confession, according to trial records. Court documents reflect that the prosecution presented the medical examiner's conclusion that Mariah's injuries could not have resulted from an accidental fall and were instead consistent with physical abuse inflicted intentionally. The prosecution's forensic case rested substantially on the testimony of Dr. Norma Farley, who had conducted the autopsy. According to trial records, Dr. Farley testified that the child's injuries, including bruising distributed across multiple areas of the body in varying stages of healing, a head injury, and internal trauma, were the product of deliberate physical harm rather than accidental injury. She testified, according to court documents, that the pattern and nature of the injuries led her to conclude that abuse was the cause of death. Additionally, the prosecution presented testimony from Texas Ranger Victor Escalon, who had conducted the interrogation of Lucio on the night of Mariah's death. According to trial records, Escalon testified that he had determined Lucio's guilt based on his observations of her physical demeanor during the interrogation, specifically citing her posture, her passivity, and her failure to maintain eye contact with him during the session. Court documents record that this testimony was offered as evidence of Lucio's culpability. In post-conviction proceedings, this testimony was formally challenged, with expert witnesses and judicial findings concluding that claims of guilt determination based on behavioral observation had no scientific foundation. According to court records, the defense strategy centered on disputing the prosecution's interpretation of the forensic evidence and challenging the reliability of the interrogation statements as an accurate reflection of Lucio's conduct. Defense counsel presented the argument that Mariah's injuries were consistent with those that could result from a fall down a staircase of the type present at the family's new residence. Court documents indicate that Lucio's attorney acknowledged during the trial that she had engaged in physical discipline of her daughter, but maintained that she had not caused Mariah's death. Defense counsel sought to present expert testimony addressing the clinical context of Lucio's behavior during the interrogation. According to appellate filings, a psychologist, Dr. John Pinkerman, and a mitigation specialist, Norma Villanueva, had evaluated Lucio and were prepared to offer testimony regarding the effects of her history of trauma and abuse on her behavior during high-pressure questioning. Court records document that the trial judge ruled that this expert testimony could not be presented to the jury during the guilt phase of the proceedings. This ruling, and its effect on the adequacy of Lucio's defense, became a central issue in subsequent appellate proceedings at both the state and federal level. According to court records, the defense also sought to call Lucio's older children as witnesses, some of whom had reportedly observed Mariah's fall on February 15, 2007. Legal filings in post-conviction proceedings raised questions about whether trial counsel had adequately investigated and pursued these potential witnesses. Court documents indicate that none of Lucio's children were called to testify during the guilt phase of the trial. The jury in the case was selected from the Cameron County community and heard testimony over the course of the trial proceedings. According to court records, following the conclusion of the evidence phase of the trial, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. The trial then proceeded to the sentencing phase, during which the jury was required to make determinations about future dangerousness and the appropriateness of a capital sentence. The jury in the case was selected from the Cameron County community and heard testimony over the course of the trial proceedings. According to court records, following the conclusion of the evidence phase of the trial, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. The trial then proceeded to the sentencing phase, during which the jury was required to make determinations about future dangerousness and the appropriateness of a capital sentence. According to court records, the sentencing phase involved the presentation of additional evidence by both the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution presented testimony regarding the likelihood of future danger, including statistical testimony from an expert who acknowledged, according to court documents, that his analysis did not address Lucio specifically. The defense presented mitigation evidence addressing Lucio's personal history, including expert testimony from 2 mitigation specialists who described her history of abuse and her mental health status. The jury returned findings that authorized the imposition of a death sentence under Texas law. Following the jury's determination, the court imposed a sentence of death on Melissa Lucio on July 10, 2008. The trial of Melissa Lucio has subsequently been examined extensively in appellate proceedings and legal scholarship. Multiple courts reviewed the question of whether the exclusion of the psychological expert testimony constituted a constitutional violation. According to published appellate opinions, a unanimous 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit concluded that the exclusion of this testimony violated Lucio's constitutional right to present a complete defense. The importance of the trial section of this case, as documented in court records, lies in its demonstration of how evidentiary rulings during the guilt phase can substantially affect the jury's ability to evaluate the reliability and context of interrogation statements. The trial proceedings form the legal foundation upon which more than 17 years of subsequent appellate activity has been built. The court sentenced Melissa Lucio to death on July 10, 2008, following the jury's determination during the sentencing phase of the trial. According to court records from the 138th Judicial District Court of Cameron County, the sentence was imposed by Judge Arturo Nelson, consistent with the jury's findings under the statutory requirements governing capital sentencing in Texas. The imposition of a death sentence under Texas law automatically triggers a direct appeal to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the state's highest court for criminal matters. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a decision on the direct appeal in 2011, affirming Lucio's conviction and death sentence. According to the published opinion from that proceeding, the court reviewed the legal arguments presented on her behalf and declined to find reversible error in the trial proceedings. With the conclusion of the direct appeal process, the case moved into the post-conviction phase of proceedings, which involved the filing of applications for writs of habeas corpus in both state and federal courts. Subsequent legal challenges were filed in the federal court system. In 2019, a three-judge panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit ruled in Lucio's favor, determining that her right to present a complete defense had been violated when the trial court excluded the expert testimony regarding her psychological profile and its relevance to her behavior during the interrogation. According to the court's opinion, this exclusion was constitutionally significant. However, the Fifth Circuit subsequently convened an en banc proceeding in which a majority of the court's judges reversed the three-judge panel's ruling in February 2021 by a vote of 10-7. A dissenting opinion joined by 7 judges characterized the exclusion of the expert testimony as irrational, though the majority concluded that the strict limitations governing federal habeas corpus relief precluded the grant of relief. In January 2022, the Cameron County District Attorney's Office signed an execution warrant for Lucio, and her execution was scheduled for April 27, 2022. In the period leading up to that date, a substantial clemency campaign was conducted, resulting in letters from a bipartisan majority of both the Texas House of Representatives and the Texas Senate, requesting that the governor and the Board of Pardons and Paroles act to prevent the execution. On April 18, 2022, Lucio's legal team filed an application for a writ of habeas corpus with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, raising 4 specific claims, including the use of false testimony, the availability of new scientific evidence, actual innocence, and the suppression of exculpatory evidence. On April 25, 2022, 2 days before the scheduled execution date, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay of execution and ordered the 138th Judicial District Court of Cameron County to conduct hearings and consider the claims raised in the habeas application. According to the court's order, the stay remained in effect pending the resolution of the remanded proceedings. In January 2023, Cameron County District Attorney Luis Saenz and Lucio's defense counsel jointly submitted agreed findings of fact and conclusions of law to the trial court, acknowledging that the original prosecution had withheld favorable evidence from the defense in violation of the constitutional standard established in Brady v. Maryland. In April 2024, Judge Arturo Nelson signed the agreed findings and recommended that Lucio's conviction and death sentence be overturned. In October 2024, following additional hearings on the remaining claims, Judge Nelson issued further findings in which he determined that Melissa Lucio is actually innocent and that she did not cause her daughter's death. He recommended that both the conviction and the death sentence be vacated. These findings and recommendations were transmitted to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which retains final authority over the matter. According to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, is the designated facility for female inmates sentenced to death in the state of Texas. The unit is located in Coryell County, approximately 150 miles north of the Cameron County Courthouse, where Lucio was sentenced. According to institutional records and TDCJ administrative documentation, Lucio has been housed at this facility since her transfer following sentencing in 2008. The Mountain View Unit operates under the administrative jurisdiction of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and functions according to the department's established protocols for housing individuals under sentence of death. According to TDCJ policy documentation, inmates sentenced to death are housed in single-occupancy cells designated for this population. The physical conditions of the housing unit reflect the standard institutional design applied to death row facilities within the Texas prison system, consisting of individual cells organized within a secure housing area. According to TDCJ administrative records, the daily routine for inmates housed under sentence of death at the Mountain View unit is structured according to a fixed institutional schedule. Inmates are permitted specific periods for recreation, which may include time in an outdoor or enclosed recreation area. Legal access, including the ability to communicate with attorneys and review legal materials relevant to ongoing proceedings, is governed by departmental policy and is available to inmates in accordance with constitutional requirements. According to institutional documentation, inmates under sentence of death have access to mail correspondence, subject to applicable security review procedures. Visitation at the Mountain View unit is conducted according to TDCJ visitation policies, which establish approved visitor lists, scheduling procedures, and the physical conditions under which visits occur. According to institutional documentation, contact between inmates and visitors is subject to the security protocols applicable to the facility. Court documents and publicly available reporting indicate that Lucio has maintained contact with family members and legal representatives throughout her incarceration, and that legislators, legal advocates, and representatives from advocacy organizations have visited the facility in connection with her case. According to TDCJ records, the Mountain View unit houses a small number of women under sentence of death at any given time, making it one of the smaller death row populations in the Texas prison system by absolute numbers. Public reporting on the facility indicates that the female death row population has typically consisted of fewer than 10 individuals at any time in recent decades. Lucio has been among this population continuously since 2008. The period of Lucio's incarceration on death row spans more than 17 years as of February 2026. This duration reflects the extended nature of capital post-conviction proceedings in the Texas court system, including the automatic direct appeal, multiple rounds of state habeas corpus review, federal habeas corpus litigation, and the most recent cycle of proceedings initiated following the 2022 stay of execution. According to court records, the legal proceedings in her case have involved filings in the 138th Judicial District Court of Cameron County, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, and the United States Supreme Court. During the period of her incarceration, Lucio has continued to maintain her account of events, as documented in legal filings and public statements made through her attorneys. According to court documents, she has maintained that her daughter's death resulted from the fall that occurred on February 15, 2007, and has consistently denied responsibility for causing her daughter's injuries. The extensive duration of her time on death row has coincided with the development of new forensic evidence, shifts in medical and scientific understanding relevant to the case, and a series of judicial findings that have progressively altered the legal posture of her conviction. As of February 2026, Melissa Lucio remains incarcerated at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, under a sentence of death that is subject to active judicial review. According to court records, proceedings initiated by the April 2022 stay of execution have not yet reached a final conclusion. The most recent formal judicial action in the case was the issuance of findings by District Judge Arturo Nelson in October 2024, which were made public in November 2024. According to the text of Judge Nelson's findings of fact and conclusions of law, the court determined that clear and convincing evidence exists that no rational juror could have convicted Melissa Lucio of causing her daughter's death after considering all evidence from the original trial alongside the new evidence that has since been developed and presented. Judge Nelson further concluded that constitutional violations occurred during the original prosecution, including the suppression of evidence favorable to the defense in violation of Brady v. Maryland, and that the expert psychological testimony excluded at trial was indispensable to a constitutionally adequate defense. He additionally found that the Texas Ranger's testimony that he could determine guilt from behavioral observation was disconfirmed by scientific research and therefore false. Judge Nelson's findings and recommendations were transmitted to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in November 2024. Under the procedural framework governing Texas capital post-conviction proceedings, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals holds final authority to adopt, modify, or reject the trial court's recommendations and to issue a final order determining the disposition of Lucio's conviction and death sentence. As of February 2026, the court had not yet issued that ruling. Because Melissa Lucio has not been executed and her legal proceedings remain active, no final statement exists within the official records of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. According to public statements made through her legal representatives, she has maintained her position that she is innocent of the charge for which she was convicted and that her daughter's death resulted from an accidental fall. As of February 2026, execution in this case has been stayed pending resolution of the remanded claims before the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. This case remains on the death row list under active litigation.